going to solve the enigma of the Russian soul. So without much ado, please.
Thank you, Klimena, for your kind words, and thank you for having us here. And when we decided to write a new book about the Russians abroad and the Kremlin, it was a very difficult choice for us. You know, we are Russian journalists, and as Klimena mentioned, we wrote two books, one on the Russian security services and another one on the Kremlin's wars on the internet. And as reporters, we have been covering conflict zones, terrorism, and politics for many, many years, but we've always been as far from emigration as you even could imagine. No one from our families emigrated. The Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, and Russians fled the country extensively for more than 100 years. The Tsar's crazy politics. There were a lot of good reasons for that. The Tsar's crazy politics toward Jews, the revolution, the civil war, the Second World War, and eventually the crazy anti-Semitism toward Jews during the Soviet times. All of these forced people to emigrate, forced millions to emigrate from Russia, from the Soviet Union. But in the 90s, the time we remember very well, emigration was in the spotlight of the society because for the first time in many decades, the borders got opened and people started emigrating freely. So people started moving in both directions. Most of them were coming out of the country, but some Russian immigrants came to Russia to capture new economic opportunities. As it turned out, the 1990s was the only time when Russia didn't have political emigration. When Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, it happened 20 years ago, he reintroduced political immigration immediately. Already in 2000, he expelled the first group of his political opponents. It was a group of Russian oligarchs from the country, and he never stopped since then. Simultaneously, the Kremlin came to see Russian immigrants as a tool for promoting its influence inside the country and outside the country, and you know that the Kremlin created a concept of Ruski Mir, Russian world, which means a worldwide community of Russian-speaking people whose identity closely connected with Russian culture and with Russian history. And as a result, we got three things here. Putin has been pushing for years his political opponents out of the country, and sometimes literally putting them on the plane and to take them out of the country, as it happens with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a Russian oligarch who was literally put on the plane and sent to Berlin. Did you remember?
No, to Germany.
To Germany. To Germany. But once out of Russia, in the West, the exiles still present a big danger and a huge challenge to the Kremlin. And the Kremlin takes this challenge very seriously. And the Kremlin takes this challenge very seriously, using all means possible to deal with political exiles, with political emigrants, including intimidation, spying, and even killing. In our book, we tell a story of a young Russian politician, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who now lives in Washington, in the United States. He was poisoned twice when he visited Moscow. The first time he was poisoned in 2015 and then in 2017. But fortunately he survived and he's still active and he continued lobbying anti-Kremlin sanctions in the United States and in Europe and the European Union. And Finally, thanks to the long history of Russian emigration, there are so many Russian people now out of the country that the Kremlin sees them an opportunity for promoting its its propaganda abroad, and also to achieve Putin's personal goals, personal goals in domestic and international politics. We spent 20 years writing about the Russian secret services, and what we realized is that Putin's spies are still very much of the old KGB, of the Soviet KGB of the 1980s. And you know that the KGB was a direct descendant of the Stalin's secret services. Stalin's obsession with political emigration was a defining thing for his spy agencies. Stalin expelled his biggest political rival, a famous revolutionary Leon Trotsky, back in the 1920s. But when he found out that Trotsky kept fighting Stalin and kept fighting Stalin from abroad, which was very predictable, Stalin tasked his many agents abroad to spy on Trotsky and eventually to kill Trotsky. But Stalin's obsessions with Trotsky supporters was so great that he insisted to fight Trotskyists even after Trotsky assassination in August of 1940 in Mexico. For instance, in January of 1941, the Moscow Center sent a secret cable to its chief, to the chief of intelligence station in New York, urging him to intensify struggle against Trotskyists. Imagine, it was January 1941. The Second World War already started. France was invaded, and it's only 6 months left until the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. But Stalin was busy following and spying on Trotskyists abroad in the United States and in Europe. And when we started, I want to say that when we started research for our book, we were quite sure that Stalin's secret services were quite far and don't look like the Russian intelligence service, the modern intelligence service. But when we finished our research, we realized that they are very similar to each other. And as we describe in our book, the experience defined, and as we described in our book, this paranoid Stalin's experience defined methods of Soviet intelligence even after Stalin's death. And this experience made a big lasting impact on the modern Soviet intelligence, which is not good.
As Irina said, our book focuses on one particular thing in a very big, large topic of the Russians abroad. And it is a big topic. There are plenty of books, including in this very institute. For instance, a great book, Other Russia, written by Misha Glenny's father, Michael Glenny, and it's here. I advise you to take it and read it. A great collection of stories of several waves of Russian emigration. But our book is about the Kremlin's ways of dealing with the political challenge posed by the Russians abroad. And if we need to think about the political challenge, we need to talk about fear, sometimes irrational fear. Because it's quite ironic that the Kremlin, as Irina said, pushes its opponents out of the country, always claiming that they are not very important and pose no threat to political stability. But then Moscow gets obsessed with the challenge posed by these very people, now exiles, the oligarchs like Kuczynski or Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, or journalists like Vladimir Karamurza, or politicians slash celebrity like Garry Kasparov. And we all know that These people are not the most popular politicians in the country. Even now, Putin enjoys huge popularity, and even people like Kasparov might be popular among tiny percent of Moscow intelligentsia. And yet the Kremlin find them extremely dangerous. The best way to explain this phenomenon is to talk about the Kremlin's fear of another revolution. The Kremlin believes, and people around and inside of the security services believe the same thing, that in 1917, a small bunch of Russian exiles, led by Trotsky and Lenin, supported by foreign funding, took over the mighty Russian Empire, one of the biggest countries in the world, with probably the most powerful secret police, just like that. And many in the Russian secret services we spoke to believe that Lenin was an agent of the German general staff. And now this is a semi-official line judging the state TV. So why, say, another group of exiles, however small and insignificant, could not repeat the same success if the situation would allow them to? And of course, this approach ignores much of the history of the first half of the 20th century, and first of all, the First World War, which actually happened to destroy not one but four empires, including the Austrian Empire, with Vienna's capital. But it hardly matters, and it hardly mattered to the Kremlin for all these years. And it's very far from the reality, because if you look at the history of successes and failures of Russian political immigration, the real situation would look very, very different. And the very history of Russian immigration could be seen as a sort of exhibition of what could be done and could not be done with the political regime like Bolshevik regime from abroad. Over the last century, the Russian political exiles tried almost everything they had at their disposal. First, they launched a terror campaign. They started sending agents to Russia to kill Bolsheviks and to blow off buildings and offices of Bolshevik organizations. They also attacked Soviet officials abroad when they happened to be abroad. When the Soviet army got involved in military conflict outside the country, like in Spain in the 1936, 1939, the Russian political immigration sent the soldiers there to fight them directly. When the Second World War started, some of the political emigres took the side of the enemy, thinking that it could help to overthrow the communist regime. During the Cold War, many political exiles participated in a propaganda war. They helped to send balloons over the borders with leaflets. Some of them joined at the radio station targeting Soviet people. When that failed, they started staging manifestations and protest rallies in the West, in the United States and Europe, and once even bombed the office of the Soviet trade company Amtorg in New York to attract attention to the plight of Soviet Jews. Now, when all of that is a history, we can assess the effectiveness of all these actions. And sorry to say, but most of these efforts completely failed. The political emigre organizations remained a thing in itself. But worse, it became very clear while we researched this book that the Russians abroad were notoriously bad at building political organizations, to much of despair of the Americans who tried to help, like famous American diplomat George Kennan. The Russians constantly argued and intrigued, and nothing actually worked. But it was just one thing where the Russians abroad succeeded. Surprisingly, this thing is the books we wrote and smuggled to the West. These books became instrumental at changing the way the West see the Soviet Union and the situation in the country. Take Solzhenitsyn or Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter. These are just few examples how significant and big it was. If nothing else, the books worked. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed the game completely because the very first time, as Irina said, the borders were opened. And some Russians got back. They were mostly descendants of the second and third generation of Russian emigration. The Russian political exiles they tried to get back to the country exactly as George Kennan had hoped, but they didn't find a proper ground in the Soviet Union and a free Russia, and even now they have offices in the country, but nobody knows what they are doing. But new financial opportunities opened up in New Russia, and that attracted many Russians from the US. Putin was a politician who understood that and exploited it when he came to power. Thanks to these Russians, the people who had come to the country to capture new opportunities, as Irina said, Putin scored some spectacular successes with the Russian diaspora. For instance, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, known as the White Church, in contrast to the Red Church based in Moscow, for many decades it embodied the idea of the other Russia, the Russian community abroad, uncompromised by cooperation with the communists. Many of people, including my parents, for instance, they saw this church as a spiritual, uncompromising force which might one day come back to Russia and fix the country. But Putin wanted one united Russia. He didn't like alternative versions. So in our book, we tell the story how the Russians abroad, specifically aristocrats, they helped Putin to eliminate this problem and subordinate the White Church to the Patriarch in Moscow. And on its way, Putin secured support of many descendants of the first wave of emigration, including aristocracy. And surprisingly, many of them now full-heartedly support Putin in what he is doing in the country and what he is doing outside, even including the annexation of Crimea. There might be many explanations why it happened, but we think the most probable explanation is that the descendants of the first wave of Russian emigration and Putin, they share one thing, the mentality of the 19th century. They actually believe in the divide of global spheres of influence, and the great saying of one of the last Russian Tsars, that Russia has only two allies, Russian fleet and Russian army. But today, the large community of the Russians abroad are both the challenge and the opportunity. It is a challenge because these days we have the Russians in the center of Washington, London, and some other European capitals aspiring to have a say in defining these countries' politics towards Russia. And in some cases, for instance, with the Western sanctions, they are extremely successful. And Vladimir Kara-Murza was actually instrumental at introducing some of the anti-Kremlin sanctions in the US and now in Europe. And given the hysterical reaction in Moscow, the Kremlin takes this challenge very, very seriously. And of course, it is also an opportunity, because for 20 years the Kremlin invested a lot of resources and efforts into building so-called Compatriots organizations all over the world. And we have a big difference in how you use words like compatriots and emigres. This started back in the Soviet days. So the emigres in the Soviet terminology was used to describe people who emigrated, moved out of the country, and they became loyal to the country they now live. And the compatriots was used for the people who emigrated but stayed loyal to the Kremlin. Now we have lots of these organizations all over the world, in Europe and in the United States. But it's still very unclear what these organizations are capable of achieving. What we've realized when we researched the book, that for instance in 2016, when we had this big scandal with the presidential election in the United States, and we had Russian spies specifically interfering in the presidential elections, the Compatriots organizations based in the United States were never activated. It's a very big question why and what we will be capable to achieve but it looks like they're just there, waiting for a proper moment. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of questions. I just thought it was quite interesting to have this sort of sense of the historical overview and the connections you have found in your research, because I guess that if you hadn't found the similarities and affinities they did, you could have focused on the modern period, which is your main topic.
Absolutely.
But it is because of these connections with the past that are actually important, not just because you're reading a history, but because the history explains what's going on now. And I think that, you know, for people outside Russia, this is something very interesting to learn in order to understand all these, you know, sensational things we hear about, you know, Russian politics and so on. So, do you have any questions? Yes, please.
Could you give him the mic?
Yes, thank you for this interesting presentation. And my question is about the concept of the Russian world, Ruski Mir. You said that Kremlin invented this concept here and was very instrumental in using it during Putin's time. So my question is, could you a bit elaborate on this? Sorry. My feeling was, and my impression earlier was that it was not the Kremlin but Russian Orthodox Church which invented this concept here, and then at some stage it was somehow retaken by the Kremlin, and initially it was a kind of instrument of soft power, but later it became kind of instrument of hard power, especially we saw it during the Ukrainian conflict here and annexation of Crimea. So whether it was really Kremlin who invented this concept, and was it invented specifically for dealing with this Russian diaspora, or so? No, please elaborate on this. It's really very interesting.
You're absolutely right. Kremlin didn't invent this concept entirely. Of course, when we're talking about the Kremlin inventing something or something else, we mean that Kremlin adopted ideas that already existed or being created by somebody else, and started using it for its own purposes, for its own goals. So, to me, the concept of Russian world is a great thing. It includes a lot of things, like not only Russians abroad or Russians living in the former Soviet Union, in the countries that were former Soviet Union republics, and it's not only Orthodox things which united all the people, all these people together. It's, I don't know, the concept of Russian world, it's a great wide concept that have to apply to the heart not every Russian immigrants, even every person who connected with Russian culture, whether a Jew or Uzbek or somebody. So if he or she lives in Europe and the United States, I mean abroad. And it's also a concept which is widely used in the countries like Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and others, applying to the people who are not only Russian people, I mean ethnic Russians, but also to the people who feel sympathy to Russia or for the Kremlin. So we should not narrow this concept because it's huge. And that's why Putin is very inventive, using all these things to attract sympathies for his politics.
I just wanted to add that we have several stages here. For instance, in the 1990s, Yeltsin was the first Russian president. He was the first to raise the issue of the Russians abroad, and he had his Congress of Compatriots. But back then it was absolutely, I would say, innocent, because it had nothing to do with getting back Crimea, or there was no actually any imperial designs in his ideas. What he wanted to do, he wanted to attract the descendants of the Russian emigration. He wanted to invite them back to the country to try to fix the country, actually. His idea was that for 70 years we saw great tragedy, and it was very unfortunate that we had so many people forced to leave the country, and we need to, because we finished with the communists, who was the cause of this tragedy. We need to fix the country while helping these people getting back, and maybe helping the country on the way to fix ideology, to fix what was broken in Russia. Putin completely changed this idea. He had his first Congress of Compatriots already in 2000, and he immediately made it very clear that he wanted to restart the whole concept. For instance, he even restarted the numbering of this Congress. So his Congress of Compatriots was the first, according to his history. And he invited these people, but he told them a completely different message. What he said that strong diaspora could exist only if we have a strong state. So he immediately explained to them that, look, we are here to help us to build a strong state, and you would be would be helping us to build it. So he wanted to exploit them. But back then in 2000, and I would say it was probably the case for the early 2000s, he was not really interested in people who, the ethnic Russians who remained living in former Soviet republics. Actually, he got really angry when he saw in the whole of his first Congress of Compatriots people from Central Asia and from Ukraine, and subsequently the minister who was in charge of arranging this Congress of Compatriots, he was fired, because back then Putin was interested to see Russians from Europe and the United States, not people from the former Soviet Union. And that changed only in the beginning of 2000s, when he understood that he needed to do something for Ukraine and all that. And I would say that probably the concept of Ruski Mir was not even invented by the church. We had a Russian writer, an author, Eduard Limonov, who was the first, and he was very nationalistic, who was the very first guy to start saying that we need to do something about protecting the interest of Russians abroad, specifically in the Baltics and Kazakhstan. But he was not, say, praised for that. Instead, he was sent to jail, because back then in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, it was not deemed a very good strategic idea for Putin to raise this issue. So when the situation changed, he just picked up this slogan and became, using it.
And also, talking about this concept and Putin's ideas of Ruski Mir, we have to mention Alexander Dugin, because a guy who also put a lot of ideas into this concept. So when we are talking about the Kremlin invented, we mean that Kremlin adopted, Kremlin used this.
Thanks so much. I have a couple of questions. One is maybe quite silly, but still I think what is most interesting about your work is, of course, like your methodology and your sources, because obviously like investigative journalism is something which I'm a bit familiar with, but still what one should do to become an investigative journalist or researcher of the topic of secret services, and what kind of sources you are working with, if you can share this and give some insights, because I can imagine it's quite special and you should strongly protect your interlocutors, and probably there are some other special moments with your work, but also a bit of problem, so your audience, your readers cannot really like check somehow, but how they can trust you. So are there any kind of methodological things you employ to have this kind of, I don't know, trust or maybe kind of shared authority between you and the audience? So you not only say to people that this is this and that, but somehow you can, I don't know, you can really show or prove how you work and why you do this or that statements, in fact, about the things which are so really like secret and hidden from the general audience. And my second question is about this idea of, or notion of emigration. Could you please maybe give a couple of, don't know, ideas about how you structure this super huge group of people? So are there like particular persons you are focused on, or particular groups, or how you basically like structure this super big number of people who are probably of very different political opinions and very different backgrounds. So actually, how do you work with such a huge concept? Yeah, thank you.
Well, actually,
You want to take the first?
yeah, and part of the second. But you're free to. So the thing is that I'm sorry to say, but when you read a newspaper, no matter you are reading about secret services or environmental disaster, you cannot check all the sources used by journalists by the very fact that you are not there. So the only thing you can deal with and is reputation of this particular media, of this particular journalist. And we've been writing about these things for 20 years, and that actually which made our reputation. So people just trust what we say because it's about 20 years. Of course, we have sources, and we developed some of the sources back in the. We started writing about these things in 1999, mostly because of two things: because of Putin coming to power, and because of the Second Chechen War. Because the Second Chechen War was presented to the public not as a war, but a counter-terrorist operation. And meaning that the Russian security services were the first to deal with the situation, not the army. So back then we believed that the Russian security services would be very, very important. It would be a very hot topic, and we started researching. Back then it was much easier than now because, well, the country was different, and even the security services were much more open. And but actually, it was not about openness. But when you have some catastrophic events in your country, like terrorist attacks, civil war, it actually helps you to win your sources, because lots of people inside of secret services are not extremely happy how the things are run by their superiors. And then you found yourself in the same spot with some officers, and you are in, I don't know, in 100 meters from the school in Beslan, and you see all these kids killed. That helps you to win trust of these people in the security services, because they see exactly the same thing, how disastrous it was, and they are not happy, and they wanted to share some information with you. And your task is just to keep cultivating these contacts. Also, the security services is not only spies, it's also bureaucracy, which means you have a lot of people inside who are not very happy with their superiors, because they are unhappy with their salaries, with the apartments they believe they should be granted, with profits and all that. And that makes them to go to journalists and expose the doings of their colleagues. So that's the way you actually get information.
But I have to say that it's getting harder and harder to get information from security services now, because, as Andrei told, we started many years ago, and that time in Russia, journalists were important people. publishing your information, exposing your information on the newspapers and on the website, you can solve some of your problems, and you can get a lot of attention, and even for not for officers of the security services, but for the whole departments of the security services, it was a huge issue to publish something in papers. And then I remember that when I was really literally 22 years old, the FSB general, who was in his 50s or 60s then, talked to me and provided me with information about the FSB structure and about what's going on inside the FSB, because he wanted to expose corruption inside one of the departments of the FSB at Lubyanka, and he wanted, of course, to his corrupted boss to step down. So what was the case? It was much easier, and back then. But of course, it's getting harder and harder. But today you can use some digital tools to investigate, for instance, security services corruption. But of course, you can get information from inside the security services using internet or digital investigative tools. Unfortunately, people are gold, and they are the main sources for the information.
Yeah, and actually that's
not digital.
We try to. It's not an academic book, so it's based on our conversations with people, and we try to make it as human as possible. For instance, we had this idea, which Clemena mentioned, that a lot about present policies of the Kremlin towards emigration could be explained through history. But you cannot just write that down because it's not very convincing. So what we did, we found a family, actually, which started with two very famous Soviet spies. One of them actually was instrumental at killing Trotsky. And these two guys started a family who is, and this family is still very important in present-day Moscow. And actually, so you can have all this continuity through this family. You can see what this family was doing in the 40s and how they were awarded for the achievements, and what happened with them after Stalin's death. And you can immediately see that despite all these talks of the KGB that we have nothing to do with Stalin, nevertheless, we people were kept praised by Andropov and his successors, even in the 80s. And even now, as a present-day spies, we are taught using the notebook, actually, the manual written by one of his spies. So you have all this continuity, and you immediately grasp that this tradition was never broken. And you talk to these people, and we present these people, and you can see them. We hope so. About how they structure the emigration, you're absolutely right. It's such a huge topic, as I said in the beginning. So what we decided to be focused on is political organizations. Most of them, fortunately for us, after the war, ended up in New York for several reasons. Mostly because the organization started by the white emigration. They needed to move out of Germany because of the war, and they ended up in New York. The white church also moved to New York. Trotskyists were there from the late 1930s, and the Jewish organizations were there before the war. So you can have in one geographical spot most of these organizations. Of course, some of them stayed in Berlin, some of them stayed in Paris, but I would say the most significant political organizations were based in New York and still based in New York. So that helped us, because the horrible thing for the writer is to try to tell all these stories when you have such a wide geography and we met ancestors of, descendants of the Russian first wave of immigration, for instance, in Sydney. And you cannot tell all these stories in one book. It just, you need...
You cannot put all of them in one basket.
It's
the book, The Compatriots, is not an academic book. This is a non-fiction book. So you can't read everything about emigration in this book. You can find only some particular episodes that illustrates our ideas.
And also, what I wanted to add is, we also wanted to see not only how the Kremlin tried to use these political exiles in the West, but how the West tried to use them. Yeah. And what we immediately understood, for instance, that the United Kingdom was not really good, and they gave up very early. Right after the war, they said, no, we are happy to deal only with defectors, so with people who defected from Soviet security services. So it was only for the United States to take this case, and they started funding these organizations and trying to find a way. So in our book, we also tried to understand all these moves made by the American administration, trying to find how to use these people. And George Kennan was, of course, he was really instrumental. But again, we tried to tell this story for people. For instance, we have a guy who was main assistant to George Kennan. His name is George Fisher, and he's a son to Louis Fisher, who was Moscow correspondent of The Nation, and he was close friends to Lenin. And that's why his son George was educated in Moscow in the Comintern school, and he was schoolmate with the founder of Stasi intelligence branch, Misha Wolf. And so you can see from his personal history how this guy was raised in Moscow, and it was very, I think, natural for him to become a communist, but instead he moved back to the United States, joined the army, ended up sent back to Moscow. When he saw what actually happened in Berlin in 1945, became very disillusioned with the communist idea, got back to the United States, joined the famous Harvard project, and became instrumental at defining the American policy towards Russian political exiles.
So thank you, Irina and Andrei, for this bringing up this very interesting topic. If I go back to this main topic of your presentation, Russian immigration and how the Kremlin reacts on it, or how the Kremlin relates to it. You discussed it under two main aspects, the challenges and the opportunities. I would have a short question on both aspects. The challenges, it is very obvious that an immigrant community can pose a challenge to a country, to a power. If we need an example, we can think of the Cuban immigrants in the United States. This community obviously has a significant influence on American politics, and everybody is aware of it. Is there anything comparable in the case of Russian immigrants? I would say Russian immigrants are much more dispersed. So the basic question really is, how much of the Kremlin's reaction to this is a hysteric reaction? How much of it is a rational or sober reaction? I don't think that this is fully clear. So how much of an influence really the Russians have on international politics, immigrants? The second point, the opportunities, this did not become fully clear to me. When you say that it also offers an opportunity, first of all, how does the Kremlin contact Russian immigrants that were forced to leave the country? I mean, they have very little of motivation to work for the Russian Secret Service. They have very little interest to work for the Russian agenda. So if you want to use them, it's a long way. You have to convince them. What does the Kremlin have to offer? What is the motivation of people who are in immigration to work for the Kremlin?
To me, the Kremlin's reaction to the political immigrants and exiles is it's exaggeration. The Kremlin exaggerated the threat because all these people they don't pose a huge threat to the Kremlins, and they, of course, from abroad they can't produce some kind of revolution, which is the major Kremlin's fear. But the Kremlin's fear is based on a logic theory that the Russian Revolution was organized by a small group of political emigrants who came in 1917 to Russia and organized a call and got the whole country and got the whole power in the country. And that's how the Soviet Union was born, according to their ideas. Of course, this approach is unhistorical. It's absolutely crazy because the Kremlin doesn't think about the whole historical process, that there were a lot of reasons for the Russian Revolution. There was this First World War, as Andrei mentioned it. There was a stupid and crazy Tsarist policy towards the whole people in the country. There was a Jewish question, and the Jews, contributed a lot for the Bolshevik and for the revolution and revolution movement. And all these questions, the Kremlin doesn't pay attention to all these issues and all these questions because inside, Putin believes that revolution was produced by a group of political emigrants and political exiles. And so that's why he's so afraid of people, of his political opponents who was expelled from the country by him 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or who just fled. Because he's afraid of the new revolution that could be produced by these people. That's why the Kremlin's reaction are so hysterical and paranoid. That's why they use such crazy methods like spying on political exiles, poisoning political exiles, and intimidation, and so on and so far. But some people, but there are of course some real threat to the Kremlin, and the main threat to me is the Kremlin is very furious on the anti-Kremlin sanctions, on the anti-Kremlin lobbyism in the Congress and in the European Parliament. And that's why Vladimir Kara-Murza was poisoned, because he was a very successful anti-Kremlin lobbyist on the Hill. And now he continues his anti-Kremlin, he continues to lobby anti-Kremlin sanctions here in the European Parliament. So sanctions are a huge issue for the Kremlin because it undermines the whole system of loyalty of Kremlin's officials and pro-Kremlin oligarchs to the Kremlin, because when these people are found out themselves in a position when they are deprived of these assets on the West, and they are deprived of these bank accounts on the West, and deprived of their real estate on the West, they can't send their children in Europe and in European countries and in the United States. It's undermined the whole scheme that was implemented by Putin personally and by the Kremlin back into the early 2000s. And so that's why the Kremlin officials so furious on people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Vladimir Kara-Murza personally.
I would say that you're probably right, but it's too early to judge this and to assess the situation, because we got the borders opened and transparent, which means actually that the very first time we have some political exile organizations active in Russia. For instance, you have, I don't know, Khodorkovsky, who has some organizations back in Russia, very active, and they do something, and it's completely unthinkable. It was completely unthinkable back in the 70s or 50s or 40s. We have the same guy, Vladimir Kara-Murza, traveling between the countries, and just before the COVID crisis, he was in Moscow. So some of these people, they were forced out of the country, but they can still get back. If we cannot get back in person, we can be active online. And we have a lot of Russian journalists now working for the media entities launched abroad, like in Riga, for instance, Medusa. And again, it's very new thing for the Kremlin. They do not know how to deal with that. It's also a big problem for the Western politicians. For instance, we know that some American politicians were not really happy with the Russians lobbying for the anti-Kremlin sanctions, because they saw that as an interference in the American foreign policy. Like you have some people from other countries actually trying to influence our policy towards this country. And they had this before, but it was completely different. One thing is to have Russian white immigration on payroll of the American US Department, lobbying in the US Congress, and you have these people at your disposal, and you can and they tell you how to do things. Well, it's acceptable. But when you have a present-day Russian politician who is still active in his country, like Boris Nemtsov, shuttling between Moscow and Washington and lobbying for something the Washington should do about Moscow, it's a completely different picture. And some of them Americans are not really ready for that. And as far as I know, some European politicians are also not really ready for that. They do not know how to take it. About opportunities, how you can convince people to spy. Well, it's not about, first of all, it's not only about spying, of course. Espionage is it's a very last, final stage. But there are methods which might be in use, and we saw that when we researched this book, and it was quite striking for us that almost everyone we spoke with, a Russian oligarch in exile, a Russian oligarch who came to terms with the Kremlin despite some of the difficulties, a high-ranking priest in Moscow but actually an American citizen, at some point all of them mentioned Novichok, because we were very, very uncomfortable that this kind of thing could be used against people abroad. And back then it was about Skripals in the United Kingdom. And of course they didn't care about Skripal at all. And they didn't care why Putin or the Kremlin or Russian intelligence decided to use Novichok in the United Kingdom. What they cared about is that the rules changing, they do not understand how these rules are changing. They understand that from now on they need to consider it as something which should affect their life too, and they are getting much more cautious, and they need to be to become much more cautious. And the message from the Kremlin might be not very appealing to some of these people, but the fear could be very, very effective, especially if you are dealing with the country with such a recent post-totalitarian history. You just need to remind them what could happen, and that's it. People get scared not very easily, but they sort of understand, it clicks.
Thank you a lot for a very interesting and informative talk. I have several very short questions. You were mentioning that Russian authorities, they clearly differentiate between post-Soviet space and Western space. But I was wondering whether you could discern different regions or whether Russian authorities differentiate different regions within the West in terms of how they work with this diaspora or with this community of connationals. In particular, like we can think about Baltic countries where basically these Russian-speaking communities, they represent a political force on their own right, or whether you could see some differences in the ways they target or they forge this organization in Western European countries and the United States, for example. And then I have a question regarding how they, because you were speaking about this recent change in these immigrants turning back their loyalties to Russian state, and whether Russian state, they offer them any way to relate and to forge this relationship, I mean in institutionalized manner, because there was a law on repatrialization, when you can like reclaim your citizenship, whether it somehow makes any difference or it really remains very, very minor, so that those who originate from Russia, yes, that they claim and repatriate into their citizenship, or whether there are any other forms of symbolic belonging that they offer, you know, that this relation, they could take some form. And also just your personal opinion about, because when you are speaking about opponents of the current regime, they always emerge as individuals, while those who are in a way supportive of the current regime, they appear as a kind of organization or a kind of more mass movement. And I was wondering, just your personal opinion in terms of how do you think why it didn't happen that basically these oppositionally minded people, they did not manage to mobilize around the recent events, or why this community or movement building, it did not happen around, I mean, also recent political events, for example, constitutional reform or recent changes, because you could see similar tendencies as Ukrainian community. Yes, it was probably not there, but it was clearly to a certain extent forged through that discontent with what was happening in their home country. And in case of Belarus, you could see also similar, that people actually started creating community in basically disagreeing in what is happening. So why we cannot see similar tendencies among at least parts of Russian immigration? Thank you.
Let me start from the end. Maybe you start with first
From the
question.
first.
Yeah,
you want to start from the first.
You want? Okay,
Yeah.
good.
I mean, the Kremlin uses such instrument like in all countries in the West and in the territory of former Soviet Republic. They use the same tools and instruments. First, the organization called Россотрудничество, which has a lot of entities in every country, and the Kremlin spent a lot of money for Россотрудничество. Sometimes it's, I don't know how effective it is. It's still unclear, because it's clear that it looks like more like a ministry or a government agency, and it got a lot of money from the Kremlin, but the activities that are organized across the world, it's beyond that they provide the cover for the Russian spies. Beyond these activities, they spent a lot of money for cultural events, for some parties or things like this.
Manifestations.
And manifestations.
Бессмертный
And
полк, yeah.
it's unclear how effective it is. We don't know. Just so far we didn't see some kind of huge manifestations that could I don't know, they could change something. But it's quite visible for demonstrating some kind of pro-Kremlin activities in different countries, in the United States, in Europe, or anywhere. Another Kremlin's tools is, of course, Orthodox Church, which is very often connecting point for different pro-Orthodox organization, pro-Orthodox youth organization, or other kind of organizations, and with conducted pro-Kremlin activities. It might be exhibitions, it might be also some kind of parties or gatherings where people discuss something. It's like very innocent activity, and it's easily can be sell as a cultural activity. So it's what's the main instruments that Kremlin uses: Россотрудничество, Orthodox Church,
Russian cultural
Russian
houses,
cultural centers.
Yes, attached to almost every embassy. Now many of them are compromised, but nevertheless they're quite active. And of course you actually already defined the sphere. So you have the Baltics, and it's one of history. Germany, it's completely another story because of the huge amount of people living there. The United States, it's a very important story for the Kremlin, and it looks like in the United States they are much more sensitive at what they are doing, and they do not want to compromise their networks. And that's probably the reason why in 2016 and even now we do not see the Compatriots networks activated. Well, I remember only one actually fact when we saw them doing something for the Kremlin, and it was right after the annexation of the Crimea. One of the Kremlin emigrate organizations, they sent a letter to President Obama saying that we are Russian Americans, we are for the annexation and you should stop blaming Putin for doing the right thing, something like that. But I do not remember it being very effective or changing public opinion in the United States. I mean, it was just a
We wrote in the book that Putin sees at Russian immigrants abroad as a recruitment base. And all this kind of activity could be accepted as some kind of recruitment of loyal immigrants by the Kremlin. But so far, these networks, if it was created, which is very possible, it was not activated.
And the last question about why the Russian immigrants were not really active recently. Well, you know, it was very depressing to talk to big names in Russian immigration, like Garry Kasparov or Khodorkovsky, for instance, and some other guys, about Russian immigration. Kasparov was maybe the most straightforward. He told me, like, you want me to go to Brighton Beach to talk to these people? Why? So for him, it looks like it's much more productive to go directly to the Hill and to lobby for the anti-Kremlin sanctions than to go down to Brighton Beach or to, I don't know, to other American cities and to talk to people on the streets. So they just see this immigration as completely helpless in a way. Khodorkovsky told me that the country is so huge that actually it's impossible to do anything about this country from outside. That's his opinion. So he believes that the only thing he could do is to support people in the country, meaning in Russia, taking some blame for instance, if some journalists have something to say, exposing political corruption in the country, he could publish it using his media sources, his media outlets, and take the blame and take the risk on him and his organization. That's his idea. But to be honest, it was very clear that we do not know what to do about the new generation of Russian exiles. For instance, right now we have lots of engineers living in the Silicon Valley. Many of these people are very political. They see what's going on in the country and they would love to do something about it. Some Navalny's people, they tried to go to the Silicon Valley and talk to them. For instance, Volkov, he tried to do that. Unfortunately, we do not see any results right now. But we have some small examples that sometimes, in some surprising ways, the Russian emigres, even apolitical ones, could be really effective at making some small changes in the country. For instance, we have this initiative called Discernet. It's actually an activity, it's a community of scientists, and they try to expose corruption in the Russian system of giving you PhD. Lots of Russian PhD are completely, I mean, it's a fake. Mm-hmm. So Russian people just use other people to write for them PhD, or it's just completely just stolen from somebody. So lots of people who now live in the West, specifically in New Zealand, in Australia, in the United States, in Germany, they contribute to this project by checking, sometimes manually, the other people's PhD to expose this kind of corruption. And actually it's a very good thing because it helps us to clean the system. And it's done mostly by people who are living abroad.
Okay, I'd like us now, if possible, to take some of the questions from our online listeners. So there's a question from Aisha. Can we have Aisha?
Okay, thank you very much. I just thanks a lot for this talk. But when I hear you, I mean, this is the emigrants' location have always been ambiguous in terms of the opportunities they provide, in terms of having a reach, especially for political reach, for many state actors, but also they pose a challenge because they escape the states. But they pose a kind of a challenge and opportunity to all the states that they are entangled with. So you were telling us a lot in terms of, you started that in relation to Russia, but their position in that, whatever that becomes an opportunity or the challenge, I think takes place in relation to a kind of a political field which involves more than the sending state or the whole state. So if we, because when I hear your story, it is, I mean, in terms of the case in Russia, it's very similar to many other, what Ludger was referring to with the Cubans, but into many kind of quote-unquote diaspora politics. And I thought that this is what you are telling us is a very clear example of those kind of transnational politics, which is happening in relation to, for example, if you take the Turkish diaspora, that how the Turkish state reaches out, and then how they are organized, how they provide pose an opportunity, but also a challenge, and how they are very much involved into what is happening in the country. So my question is that really, aren't you looking at it in a way with prioritizing too much emphasis on the Russian state, not which comes out in your responses much better in relation to the other states. But then maybe this might require to incorporate those other states into the picture, then maybe one needs a kind of a different kind of a perspective. That's what I was suggesting, maybe kind of the transnational politics. Then we have to ask, what is it really peculiar to the to Russia in this case? And the second question I have is that in terms of those Russians abroad, in all those projects, actually it tries to reach out these compatriot organizations, but these compatriot organizations are also very much shaped in a very dynamic field, and it creates its own exclusions when it's reaching out to the Russians in abroad. And sometimes it reproduces different diasporas too from that country. So, did you see anything? Do you see anything like that? For example, in terms of for Turkey, that it's the way that the Turkish state reached out to its political exiles, and but also the emigrants for very different reasons. At the end, it created a kind of an Alevi diaspora, different kind of a religious diaspora. It created, strengthening the Kurdish diaspora. So, did you see any kind of this kind of a proliferation in that immigration politics of Russia?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. But the problem is that the book is about the Kremlin and the Russian immigration. So we didn't research other diasporas and the relationship between.
Let me try to answer it, at least partly to this question. Is we also asked some of the people we spoke with about the differences and why the immigration was so important for the Russian state, and was it really that unique? And in the end of the day, the answer was that the question of diaspora was instrumental and defining for instance, for the Russian intelligence agencies. For instance, in the West, intelligence is mostly about collecting intelligence, collecting information. In Russia, and in countries like Russia, because it's not only Russia, intelligence is about protecting the political regime and policing emigres. I can say it more bluntly, for instance, if you look at the list of the countries who use assassinations abroad. And lots of countries actually use this approach. They kill people abroad. Even and in the recent past, it was even some European countries did that. For instance, the French in the 50s and Spanish in the 80s. But I would say the Russians are quite unique because the Russian intelligence services, they mostly kill their own people. For the Spanish, it was, for instance, for the Americans, it's about someone else. It's not about political opponents of the regime. In our countries, it's about militants in the first half of the 2000s and then political opponents. So it's you see the agency which is active worldwide, but always looking at the former people, at people who used to live in the country but left the country and still poses a threat. And it describes and defines almost every department inside of the Russian security agencies. And that was important for us because we've been writing about security agencies for many years, and we tried to answer to some of the questions. For instance, why we have this kind of agencies, why we had this kind of KGB, not some other kind of security agency, and why it was that unique. And the answer in most cases was obsession with the threat posed by emigres. And the question about ethnic diasporas, as far as we see, it looks like the idea of the Russian world and Russian-sponsored Compatriots organizations is to unite people who just who are from the former Soviet Union, no matter who they are in terms of their ethnicity. So nobody tried to launch special organizations to deal with, I don't know, for Ukrainians, for instance,
yeah.
Or for Belarusians, or for Tatars. The idea is just we all speak the same language, we share the same legacy of the Second World War, and we need to be united among these big topics.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we should be coming to a close, but if there's one last very short question, I think we can include that. Otherwise, well, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Since I deal with media freedom issues, and I believe that media freedom is basically about freedom of political media and political journalism. And the core of political journalism is investigative journalism. So my question is, what do you think about the future of investigative journalism in Russia? Does it have any future? If your answer is simple and you want to say that it goes into, I don't know, online world, then how it is sustainable and why it will be sustainable? Thank you.
In terms of investigative journalism in Russia, now we are optimistic because 5 years ago, Andrei and me, we made a presentation. I can't remember where, but we were talking about investigative journalism in Russia, and we told that there are only 8 or 7 investigative journalism left in Moscow, and even in Russia there should be the same situation, and investigative journalism is dying because traditional media didn't have resources to support the investigative journalism because it's dangerous, it's costly, and it seems that people are not interested in knowing more about their trouble. But right after that, we saw a lot of small investigative projects that was launched by different journalists, and it's right now it's like maybe 6 or 7 investigative journalist projects like iStories, like Project, like many others. And of course, they are all mostly about digital investigations, and they dig into the registers, information which could be publicly available on the internet or not very publicly available. But And the focus of this journalism, investigative journalism now in Russia, is mostly corruption, because it's very easy to investigate with digital tools. But it's amazing. It's really amazing, and that's great. Of course, we feel that we feel a lack of, real information which could be get from human sources, like people inside the Kremlin, people inside the presidential administration, or ministries of agencies, or governors' offices across the country. But at the same time, because we see the huge offensive of investigative journalism and corruption issue, we can expect that something like this could happen in 3 or 5 years. So I'm personally optimistic.
I'm not sure that it's actually that right now anyone knows the answer to the question about sustainability, because of course we understand that if you have such a small group of people and they work on just few stories, and you know the focus, of course it's not very sustainable in terms of we cannot be sustained with public funding. It's almost impossible, and I do not know what might be the model for them, to be honest. And of course the problem is that, as Irina said, they investigate only part of the story, so we mostly talk about corruption, and it's only part of political life in the country. But still, it means that we have some tradition and still alive, and people, at least if we take, for instance, I remember what was the situation like 15 years ago. Now it's much better in terms of, I remember that in the early 2000s, it was very, very depressing to go to a room full of strangers and to say I'm an investigative journalist. Because in most of the cases, somebody would stand up and say, okay, can I pay you $200 to write about my company? Because back then the climate in the room was, oh, well, these journalists, especially investigative journalists, all of them corrupt. We can pay them money and they can write something about our competitors. Now that changed. And so people became much more, I would say, now they're getting respect back, at least to some extent, which is good.
I didn't want to miss the opportunity since you're here, and wanted to ask you something a bit different, namely your personal involvement in this. You started by saying at the very beginning, that was I think the only personal reference that you made, that your families have never decided to go into immigration.
No. We said that nobody from our family
emigrated. That's the problem. Nobody from our
that's what I meant. Yes.
From our families emigrated.
Yes.
No one.
I mean, you're speaking about political persecution and immigration and so on, and this is the object of your study. But it could easily happen that you also become an object of this as well, that you are the object of this, and that you are might be driven into immigration, although you might not take this as an opportunity. My very simple question is to you, I mean, this is obviously that you're doing a dangerous job. Where do you take your energy from doing that? For how long can you do this? And what is your like point of a decision where you would say no, we cannot do this any longer? And in what sense does immigration also an option for you?
Of course, it's
for the first question. It's not about immigration, about the source of energy.
Okay,
for us,
talk about energy.
We love our job, and maybe the truth is that journalism is the only job we can do. Maybe there is a source of energy, because I don't know, not being journalist, I don't know, it's very difficult to imagine who we can be, because we can do anything. Could you do anything except journalism?
No, I think I'm completely hopeless.
We started when we were 20 years old, so have no other profession. And what was?
Okay, let me take it. Of course, we understand that there might be a moment where we could be forced out of the country, because, for instance, even if you do not want to, for instance, Navalny now, he was physically flown to Germany when he was unconscious, and nobody knows whether he would be allowed to get back, just because, for the Kremlin it would be easy to have him somewhere, probably in Germany, but not in Moscow. So maybe it could be not even his own decision to stay in Germany, unfortunately. And of course we understand that that could be something which could be done for us too. I think that, one thing which was really important for us when we started in profession, and it was in the middle of 1990s, it was such a great thing, and this was maybe the most respected profession in our country back then. And journalists were stood on such a high stage for the society. Of course, we lost it. We journalists, all of us. But it was such a great feeling, to be honest. And it's difficult to lose it completely. So we try to find a way to keep doing what we are doing. It's sometimes it takes some imagination. So now to talk to our audience, we need to find an American publisher to write our book in English, get it published in the United States, then wait for a year and get a publication in Russian. And that's exactly what happened with 3 of our books. And the Russian edition of the Compatriots was published last week, and the English edition was published last year. But still, it works. For now, it works, and I think it's so far, as far as it works, I think we will try to keep doing it.
Well, we all hope that you have a lot of opportunities to keep doing it and coming back to our institute, so you present your work. You've been here several times.
That's right. Thank you very much for that.
Every time I feel that when you come back, soon there's a book coming out. So you've been very productive, and we like having you here. And I'd like to just finish with one thing. I have my personal copy of the book, and I started reading it. And I think that if you have a sense that from this talk you have the summary of the book and you don't need to read it, it's wrong. Actually, the book is super, super interesting to read. It's really attention-catching, and I really recommend it. It's a great book. You learn a lot, but it is almost like reading a spy novel, except that it happens to be true. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klimena, and thank you for having us here. Thank you for the institute.